We shift now from talking about the Unanga or Alutiiq people to talking about the Sugpiaq or Alutiiq people, a group of people who have lived in the area of Kodiak Island, Alaska Peninsula, and Kenai Peninsula / Prince William Sound for thousands of years. In fact, archaeological evidence suggests 7,500 years plus. So an incredible amount of time living in this coastal environment, learning how to live a life as people in that space. Now, when we talk about the Alutiiq or the Sugpiaq, we are dealing with, once again, an endonym and an exonym. Again, endonym meaning a name that we call our own group, and an exonym, the name that other groups call us. And so Alutiiq is an exonym. It was originally applied, well, to be more precise about it, the Russian fur traders referred to Sugpiaq people as Alutiiq people, and that came to be changed to Alutiiq among Kodiak Island Sugpiaq speakers to language better, and so thus came about the exonym Alutiiq. However, the name in their own language is Sugpiaq for singular, as in the Sugpiaq culture, or Sugpiat plural, as in Sugpiat persons. Within that, there are kind of further groups, right? That's not all just kind of one homogeneous group, but instead, for example, you have the people that lived on Kodiak Island that were Alutiiq and do live on Kodiak Island, and we refer to that group sometimes as Koniag, which, if you've ever wondered where the term Kodiak Island comes from, it comes from the group of people that lived there, the Koniag. And then the group of people in Prince William Sound, including places like Seward, which is the traditional homelands of Sugpiaq people. That group of Sugpiaq people we call the Chugachmiut is probably what they historically referred to themselves as, and a lot of times in books and writings, people will just say the Chugach. And then there is like some scarce evidence that there may have been a third, not a third group, but like a third way of referring to yourself if you lived on the Lower Kenai Peninsula as a Sugpiaq person, and that would have been Unegkurmiut, but that's very dicey. We're not quite sure. At least the sources I've consulted aren't quite sure. But in any case, kind of you had these two branches of Sugpiaq society, Koniag or Kodiak Islanders and Chugachmiut, Prince William Sound. And then you also had some of those we would kind of consider Alaska Peninsula Sugpiaq community to be part of Koniag. And so here's kind of what that looks like visually to give you an understanding of it. This is what they're calling Unegkurmiut, which extends all the way up into Seward, actually the way they're drawing the map. And then here, they actually take the Chugachmiut and divide it up into like several different groups, as you can see, which brings up the point that people's identities are layered identities, right? People are going to refer to themselves often by identities for their specific village, and then more broadly for people in their region, and then even more broadly for people that speak the same language as they do. That is kind of a natural tendency of human beings. Now, if you look at the Alaska Native language map, which I've showed you several times, you'll note that there are a bunch of blue-green colors, and I mentioned before that that's a language family. Specifically, we now refer to that, or are increasingly referring to that, as the Inuit Yupik Unangam Tunu language family. You may have heard this earlier referred to as the Eskimo Aleut language family. That's becoming a less common way to refer to that group. But these are all closely related languages. And in fact, specifically Sugpiaq is really closely related to Central Yupik. So despite the fact that we tend to link Sugpiaq and Unangan or Aleut people, and yes, their languages are definitely related. One could argue that they're even more closely related to Yupik language, they're Yupik neighbors. But in any case, these are all very closely related languages. We'll talk about Inupiat and Inuit groups later, but for now, understand that Yupik, Alutiiq, and Aleut or Unangan, those languages are all really closely related to each other. I just wanted to share a few Sugpiaq words with you that I thought you would enjoy learning. I think it's good to learn a few words from each of the languages that we'll talk about if possible. I think that's especially good if you're in a context where you speak to people that might be their first language or one of their languages. It's good to know some expressions, I think, if nothing else, just to show people that you're respectful of the different languages within Alaska. So just a few phrases that you might like to know. First of all, this first one you'll see, this is actually pronounced chamai, so chamai. I know it looks like it should be kamai to an English speaker, but it's chamai. That means like hello or welcome. And then there's the phrase kuyana, or koyana, I should say, which means thank you. And then there's or which means yes. Now, if you are a Yupik speaker and know any Yupik, you're saying, wow, that really does sound a whole lot like Yupik, right? Chamai and Kuyana. And if you're a Dena'ina speaker, you're saying, oh, that's how we say yes too, or at least very similar to it. So these languages obviously were next to each other and affecting each other. Now, these are two websites that I've got links to in the slides that I strongly recommend going to on your own time. They're both very useful. One of them, is AlaskaNativeLanguages.org. And as you can see, you can kind of listen to the way these phrases are found. And you've got some like modules here where you can learn more about Sugpiaq language. So just very, very cool. And then the other one is just a treasure trove website that I strongly recommend for you. It's the Alutiiq Museum. This is specifically their language archive page, but more generally, the Alutiiq Museum is just like full of fantastic information that has been made available partly through NSF funding, but through the Alutiiq Museum, which is a prominent Sugpiaq organization, and which has it's a phenomenal museum resource online that I strongly recommend, that's cultivated and curated in large part by Sugpiaq people. So it's a great website. Anyways, that's a little bit about if you want to go deeper with the language. The language, by the way, is actually Sugcestun, which is the language of the Sugpiaq people. All right. So I want to talk now about a few other things. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about sort of life in this coastal environment. Similar to the Unangan people, kayaks, this is how that would be rendered in Sugpiaq. So kayak with a Q, or to make it plural, you put a T at the end. So anyways, kayaks, as with the Unangan people, were very, very important. The paddles tended to be, for Sugpiaq society, traditionally paddles tended to be really narrow, narrower than you're probably used to if you do a lot of kayaking, unless you do sort of traditional native kayaking or something where you've intentionally done it in the older style, but sort of modern kayaks, we don't typically see this kind of a style in. But these really narrow, long shapes, rather than the slightly broader shape of modern kayaks, would have been really useful for a lot of things. Among them, this kind of one-sided, right, instead of two-sided and thin thing, allows you to do really quick changing of direction back and forth. And through choppy waters, through windy waters, trying to get into a coastal area or an island area, this is a great way to do business. By the way, that's Sven Håkansson, who is a Alutiiq anthropologist and associated, if I'm not mistaken, with Alutiiq Museum. These would have been, again, much like Unangan, these would have been covered with sea lion skins to give them water repelling. And then this would have been like a seal. He's showing kind of a traditional form of clothing that's obviously not nearly as common anymore, but traditionally people would have worn like gut parkas that were made out of aquatic mammals' guts, and that would have been water repellent as well. So just really kind of, again, you're going to get tired of me saying things are genius, but really genius adaptations to really genius inventions for people that are working in a context of incredible amounts of rain before we had sort of plastic North Face jackets or something like that, right? Or extra tough boots or something. Whaling was incredibly important for Sugpiaq culture historically. It is not something that is done at present in Sugpiaq communities. It is done elsewhere in Alaska, particularly in some Inupiaq communities, but among Sugpiaq communities that is no longer done. It was voluntarily stopped, is my understanding, in the early 1900s when whale numbers had declined considerably in that area. Sugpiaq communities, some chose to voluntarily stop. At least that's how I've heard it. But traditionally, that was an incredibly important part of culture, and there was a very interesting way of hunting whales. So I want to share that with you, and to do so, I need to make sure that I've got Zoom set up the right way. Very good. And with any sort of luck, this will work, and we will. Okay, as I show this video, I'm not going to show the whole thing, partly because it would be a little bit bizarre to sort of have a YouTube video of me showing you a YouTube video, but I'm going to show you just a few parts and invite you to go to that link on your own time. But this is going to be 3 different anthropologists talking about the traditional whale hunting practices. They hunt whales with poison spears.
Check it out. Ready?
Yeah, I'm gonna see this. Oh, no way. Freeform for a whale lance.
Yeah, in a coniag house.
Oh, that's so cool.
This is actually really significant because this is going to be a whaling lance. It's a preform. You can see how they sawed and snapped it to make it.
Well, it's special because it's found in context. I mean, that's what is really important. Is we find a lot of those out of context, but in context, this ties a lot of the technology, the last 4,000 years of technology.
Yeah, 5
together.
Actually.
Yeah, that's really cool.
But we never find them in archaeological sites because, and it is because of the whaling cult. These things had a lot of power, and whalers were not allowed to live with normal people.
As a quick aside, it's worth pointing out that in archaeology, cult has a very different meaning than it does in everyday English and everyday language. English, the word cult is often used to refer to religious groups that are regarded as controlling. I don't find that term particularly useful. Most scholars don't. But in any case, that's not how the term is used in archaeology. Archaeology has been using that term a lot longer than people have been using it in everyday English, and it has a technical term meaning, and it's basically when there's a religious group united around a certain kind of ritual.
They're not bad and not good, but they're just kept over there because of the power that they had and knowledge. That's the person.
That's one of the whales, and the other one we haven't got on the paper yet.
The human in between is just amazing.
It is.
All things related to whales was very secret and kept apart from society. I mean, this is a very, very, very powerful magic was associated with these things.
I wouldn't describe it as being magic. I'd describe it more as having a role in society that was, I guess, an elite status.
They were considered elite, actually, but...
Well, elite, but they didn't live very long. You know, because you're dealing with poison that if you cut yourself, you're dead within a minute.
Oh. Monk's hood, the aconite poison, is a lipid-based poison. So if you just put it on here with water or some dye, it wouldn't stick. It needs fat. It adheres to fat, so it's...
So again, I'm not going to show the whole video to you in a YouTube video. That'd be strange, and I'm not sure how that works with YouTube anyways. But I really like that video. I encourage you to watch the remainder of it. He goes on to discuss the fact that the spears, people would put monk's hood poison on them, and that poison was made to adhere to the spear in part from fat from deceased human beings. And so that allowed it to adhere to it. And it's kind of interesting in that whole video to learn about these practices, right? And basically you would spear them, and then the whale would die from poisoning, and then it would eventually come back to the coast. So this is different than some other native hunting traditions where the whales are sort of dragged back. Instead, you spear the whale, and then you rely on the fact that you live on the coast and that the whale is going to get taken back to the coast eventually, that the tide will bring the poisoned whale in, and then you can harvest the meat from it. This was a very interesting way of hunting. I also like that video too. To see this way that sort of you have 3 different anthropologists from 3 different backgrounds, and the way that they're sort of building on each other's knowledge and kind of like, well, I would describe it this way. Well, I would actually describe it this way. And I really like that too. It's kind of an example of the different perspectives people can have. And I think a lot of value in that. For example, when he clarifies like, well, I wouldn't call it magic, I would refer to it as like a certain status. I thought that, was an interesting way of sort of talking about that and reframing that. So it's a really well done video from Alutiiq Museum that shows a really fascinating aspect of Sugpiaq culture. It's worth pointing out too, the video gets into this, but we didn't watch most of the video, that not only were the men who did the whaling typically off away from the communities, but also their wives were also typically away from the community. And while the men were whaling, the wives had their own sort of like ritual things that they needed to be doing and precautions and ways that they needed to be showing respect to the spiritual world, so that the men were kept safe while they were whaling. And so there's this kind of connectedness between husband and wife in that context, and this sense that sort of this is a spiritual undertaking, this highly dangerous activity of chasing whales and hunting them with poison spears.